The air in Dr. Helena Barroso's office was controlled, with a slight scent of lavender and the soft sound of a white noise generator. Everything was designed to calm. In an armchair sat Thomas, an 8-year-old autistic boy who had not spoken a word during the entire session. Helena was about to make her final notes, a little frustrated by the lack of progress. Suddenly, the silence was broken. Thomas, who until then had been staring at a pattern on the carpet, raised his head. His eyes did not focus on Helena but seemed to look through her, to a pain she kept locked away. In a clear, uninflected voice, he asked, "Ma'am, can I heal your daughter's pain?" Helena froze. Her entire body became rigid. The pen in her hand stopped millimeters from the paper. She had no children there. Her only daughter, Clara, was at home, trapped in the silence of her own world for over a year. No one in that office, no one in her professional life, knew the depth of her wound. And this boy, who couldn't answer a simple question about his day, had just seen into her soul. "Where are you watching us from? Your presence is important to us. If you believe there are forms of communication that science cannot yet explain, sign up. The journey that begins with this question will challenge everything you know about therapy and healing." The moment the office door closed behind Thomas and his mother, Dr. Helena Barroso's professional facade crumbled. She leaned against the door, her heart pounding against her ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. Thomas's question was not just a sentence, it was a key that opened the safe where she kept her agony. The outpouring came in waves of silence, a tsunami of pain that left her breathless. Helena was one of the most respected child psychologists in the city. She was the woman other parents ran to for answers. She healed, she fixed. It was what she did, but that was her public persona. At home, she was a failure. Her life was a painful lie. Every day, she advised parents on how to connect with their children, while she herself couldn't reach her own. Her 6-year-old daughter, Clara, lived like a ghost in her own home. A year ago, a car accident took the life of her husband, Clara's father. Helena was driving. Clara, in the back seat, saw everything. Physically, she was unharmed, but something in her spirit was broken. Since that day, she hasn't said a word. She withdrew into an inner world to which no one had the key. The diagnosis was traumatic selective mutism. For Helena, it was a sentence of perpetual guilt. Helena's outlet was the conversation she had with herself in the bathroom mirror late at night. It was the overwhelming guilt for being behind the wheel. It was the frustration of seeing all her therapeutic techniques, all her theories, all her experience prove useless in the face of her own daughter's pain. She was a fraud, a healer who couldn't heal herself or her loved ones. Thomas's question was so devastating because he didn't ask, "What's wrong with your daughter?" He talked about his daughter's pain, but the question was directed at her, at Helena. He saw that Clara's pain and Helena's guilt were two sides of the same coin, a shared wound that poisoned the air in the house. And the most terrifying part was, how could he know? After the accident, when Clara's silence solidified, Helena dove into what she knew best, applying method and science to the problem. Her journey in search of a cure for her daughter was paved with the most bitter of false hopes, the belief that the answer was out there somewhere, in another technique, in another specialist. First, she became a client of her own colleagues. She took Clara to the best trauma therapists in the country. Each one brought a new acronym of hope: CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy; EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing; play therapy. Helena sat in waiting rooms, her heart heavy, hoping for a miracle. Clara attended the sessions but remained distant, untouchable. The therapists regretfully admitted that they were unable to break through her barrier. The hope that a more skilled colleague would hold the key faded. Then came the alternative therapies. Desperate, Helena opened her mind to everything: art therapy, music therapy, equine therapy. She bought Clara the best art supplies, which were barely touched. She hired a music therapist whose soft melodies filled a room where Clara remained silent. She took her to a ranch, hoping that the connection with a gentle horse might awaken something. Each new attempt was a balloon of hope that slowly filled and then deflated with the lack of response. The most painful false hope was the one she placed in herself. She turned her home into a private clinic for a single patient. She read every research article, every case study. She tried active listening and emotional validation techniques. But she wasn't just a therapist. She was the mother, the source of guilt, the living reminder of the trauma. Every attempt to treat her daughter only reinforced the distance between them. Clara didn't need a psychologist at home. She needed her mother. But Helena had forgotten how to be just that. The hope she pursued was for a cure, a solution that would make everything go back to normal, that would erase the past. But every failure, every continued silence from Clara, was a confirmation of her powerlessness. What she didn't realize was that by relentlessly seeking an external cure, she was avoiding looking at her own pain, her own guilt. Thomas's question was a mirror. He didn't offer her a new therapy or a new technique. He spoke directly to the wound, and the hope he offered, terrifying as it was the first that didn't seem false. Thomas's question sparked a war inside Helena. It was a battle between the psychologist, the figure she presented to the world, and the mother, the woman she was in the darkness of her home. The psychologist in her head was rational, skeptical, and analytical. She desperately tried to find a logical explanation for what had happened. "It's echolalia," said the clinical voice. He must have heard that phrase somewhere, maybe from another therapist, and he's repeating it. It's classic autistic behavior. The psychologist saw Thomas as a set of symptoms to be deciphered, a case study. She argued that attributing a deeper meaning to the question was dangerous. Magical thinking, a projection of her own desires and fears. It was unprofessional. The psychologist panicked at the idea that something could exist outside her theories, outside the diagnostic manuals. If what Thomas did was real, then much of what she had learned and practiced for years would be incomplete, perhaps even irrelevant. On the other side was the mother. The mother didn't care about the DSM-5 or developmental theories. The mother felt the truth of the question in her bones. It didn't seem like a random repetition. The way Thomas looked at her, the clarity in his voice, the timing, it all seemed intentional. The mother, desperate for any ray of light in the darkness, wanted to believe. She was tired of methods that didn't work, of experts who didn't have answers. Mom saw Thomas not as a patient, but as a messenger, perhaps the only person in the world who truly saw her family's pain. Mom was willing to break all the rules, to risk her professional reputation, for a glimmer of hope that her son could heal her daughter. The conflict was paralyzing. If she followed the psychologist, she would document the incident as atypical vocalization, discuss it with Thomas's supervisor, and continue with her flawed methods, keeping her professional identity intact but her soul in tatters. If she followed the mother, she would be entering unknown and ethically dubious territory. What would she do? Invite a patient into her home? Entrust the healing of her daughter to a child she was treating? Herself? For days, Helena lived in this duality. At the office, she was the psychologist analyzing coldly. At home at night, looking at Clara's silent bedroom, she was the mother, crying and wondering if she was going crazy. The conflict wasn't about Thomas. It was about Helena. It was the final battle between the science she knew and the mystery she felt, between her head and her heart, between the professional and the personal. And she knew that the choice she made would define not only her daughter's future, but her own. The turning point didn't come from a logical decision. It came from a pattern. 3 days after Thomas's question, Helena was sitting on the floor of Clara's room, feeling the familiar wave of despair. Clara was at her little table, drawing. Helena leaned in to see. It was just circles, dozens of concentric circles, drawn with obsessive precision, filling the entire page. It was a drawing Clara often made, and one that Helena and the other therapists had interpreted as a symptom of her withdrawn state, a closing in on herself. But suddenly, Helena's mind was transported back to the office. She remembered Thomas in that fateful session. Before asking the question, what was he doing? He wasn't just staring at the carpet. He was tracing the circular pattern of the carpet with his finger, over and over again. And in the previous session, he had spent 20 minutes spinning the wheel of a small toy car. Circles. The connection hit her with the force of a lightning bolt. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a language of patterns, of repetition, of shapes, a language that she, with all her training in verbal and nonverbal communication, had completely ignored. She was trying to speak Portuguese to someone who only understood geometry. The silent turning point was this insight. It was the humble and shocking admission that she knew nothing, that the key to her daughter's world was not in her words, but in her patterns, and that Thomas somehow spoke the same language. At that moment, the psychologist in her was silenced. The mother took complete control. The fear of professional consequences evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming urgency. She picked up the phone. She called Thomas's mother. Her voice trembled, not with doubt, but with terrifying certainty. "Marina," she said, "I know this is the strangest and most unprofessional request you've ever heard, and you have every right to say no, but I need to ask you a favor. I need you to bring Thomas to my house." She didn't give any details. She didn't try to explain the crazy theory that was forming in her head. She just asked, with all the vulnerability of a desperate mother. And Marina, perhaps sensing the raw sincerity in Helena's voice, after a long silence, simply said, "When?" The turning point wasn't a decision, it was a surrender. Helena surrendered to the mystery, to the inexplicable. She abandoned her maps and decided to follow the most unlikely guide, in a territory for which there were no manuals. The day Thomas arrived at Helena's house was the most tense of her life. She had broken a dozen ethical rules. Her colleagues would crucify her if they knew. But when Marina and Thomas entered, something changed. The atmosphere was not clinical. It was just human. The first victory was their arrival. Helena expected to have to guide Thomas, perhaps introduce him to Clara, but he ignored her completely. He entered the house, stopped in the middle of the living room, and seemed to scan the room with senses she didn't possess. Then, without hesitation, he walked straight down the hall to Clara's bedroom door, a room he had never seen before. He stopped at the door and waited. He didn't look at Helena. He just waited. The second victory was the encounter. From inside the room, Clara, who normally wouldn't react to someone at the door, raised her head. She saw Thomas. Their eyes met for a moment. There was no smile, no wave, but there was recognition. Slowly, Clara stood up and opened the door a little wider, a silent invitation. Thomas entered and sat down on the floor. Helena and Marina watched from the doorway, holding their breath. The third victory was communication. Thomas took a small velvet bag out of his backpack and poured its contents onto the floor, a collection of smooth, polished stones of different colors and sizes. He didn't try to talk to Clara. He began arranging the stones in a complex spiral pattern. Clara watched, fascinated. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft click of stones on the wooden floor. Then, the miracle. Clara knelt on the floor, picked up one of her own wooden blocks, and carefully placed it at the end of Thomas's spiral. She wasn't imitating, she was adding to the pattern. She was responding. She was talking. Helena collapsed silently against the hallway wall, tears streaming down her face. Years of therapy, dozens of specialists, thousands of dollars. Nothing had achieved what two silent children had achieved in 20 minutes with a handful of stones. It wasn't a magic cure. It was something much more real and profound. It was connection. Pure, simple, without the baggage of words or expectations. It was the first small victory in a war Helena thought she had already lost. That night, long after Thomas and Marina had left, Helena sat on the floor of Clara's room, in the same place where Thomas had sat. The stones and blocks were still there, forming a mosaic of a silent conversation, and Helena finally understood. Her reflection was a painful deconstruction of everything she believed. She, the psychologist, saw the world through the lens of pathology. She saw Clara's silence as a symptom of trauma. She saw Thomas's repetitive behaviors as symptoms of autism. She was so busy labeling and analyzing that she forgot to see the function behind the behavior. She realized that Clara and Thomas's language wasn't deficient. It was just different. It was a language of patterns, of rhythms, of geometry, a language that predates words. Clara's trauma didn't leave her without language. It regressed her to this more fundamental form of communication. And Thomas, whose mind was naturally tuned to that frequency, was the first native speaker she had encountered since the accident. What Thomas offered was not a cure in the medical sense. He didn't take away the pain. He validated it. He entered Clara's silent world and said, with his actions, "I see you. I understand this language. You are not alone here." He wasn't healing the pain. He was healing the isolation. which was the worst part of the pain. And that was what the frozen psychologist couldn't understand. She was so focused on the wound that she forgot the power of companionship. Her deepest reflection was about herself. She was the one speaking the wrong language. She had been trying to drag Clara out of her world with the brute force of words, demanding that she communicate on her terms. It was an act of arrogance, not healing. Thomas, with his humility and innate acceptance, showed her the way. The way was not to pull Clara out, but to have the courage to enter her world, sit on the floor in silence, and learn her language. Thomas's question, "Can I heal your daughter's pain?" now made terrible and beautiful sense. It wasn't an offer of power, but a question of permission. Will you allow me to connect with her in the way I know, a way you don't? Understand? And in saying yes, Helena wasn't just opening the door to Thomas. She was opening the door to her own humility, to her own healing, to the chance to finally learn to be the mother her daughter needed. Thomas's visits became a sacred ritual in Helena's home. Twice a week, the two silent worlds met. They rarely spoke. They built things. They drew maps of imaginary cities. They created intricate patterns on the bedroom floor. They were the architects of their own shared universe. Clara's healing was not an event but a process, slow as the blooming of a flower. One day while drawing, she hummed a little tune. The following week, she smiled when Thomas arrived. And then, on an autumn afternoon, about 3 months after the first visit, as they lined up the colored stones, Clara picked up a blue stone, looked at Helena, who was watching from the doorway, and said in a fragile voice, a little hoarse from disuse, "Mom, pretty." The word, the first in over a year, hit Helena with the force of a wave. It wasn't in a therapy session, it wasn't prompted by a technique. It was a gift, freely given, born out of a space of safety and acceptance that Helena didn't create, but allowed to exist. The truth is that Thomas did not cure Clara. He gave her a map to get out of her own dark forest, showing her that there were others who spoke the language of trees and stones. He reminded her how to communicate, and when she was ready, she used that memory to reconnect with the verbal world. The closing scene of this story is a simple one. Months later, Helena is no longer treating Thomas. She ended the professional treatment, explaining to his mother that she could no longer be his therapist, but that they, as families, could be friends. Now Helena, Clara, Thomas, and Marina are in a park. The two mothers talk on a bench, while a short distance away, Clara and Thomas sit on the grass, examining a ladybug in Clara's hand. Clara is describing the spots to Thomas, and he is listening, nodding his head in understanding. The pain of Helena's loss has not gone away, but the paralyzing guilt has been replaced by deep gratitude. She has stopped trying to be a psychologist for her daughter and has simply become her mother, a mother who has learned to listen to silence, to understand patterns, and to trust in the healing power of a connection that defies explanation. Hope does not lie in a future free of pain, but in a present where communication, in all its mysterious forms, is possible, and where the most unlikely healer may be a child who teaches us a language we had forgotten. The deepest wounds sometimes don't need words, but someone who understands silence. True healing isn't about bringing someone into our world, but having the courage to enter theirs. If this story about connections that transcend words touched your soul, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss any stories. Comment on a time when you felt understood without having to say anything. Share this video. Someone, somewhere may be trapped in their own silence, needing to know that they are not alone.